We'll now go to item B2, which is related to the 2026 bond program and election, or recommendations regarding elements of that. However you want to begin.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council members. Adriana Castan, Director of Capital Delivery Services. With me, I have Eric Bailey, Deputy Director, and Marcus Hammer, Assistant Director. And I'm going to turn it over to Eric Bailey to start the 2026 bond staff recommendations.
Pleasure to be here. Eric Bailey, Deputy Director, Capital Delivery Services. Good to see you all today. So first, we're going to go through quickly some of the council resolutions that began the 26 bond development process, talk about the development of the needs assessment and bond recommendations, talking about the initial staff draft, the bond election advisory task force recommendations, updated staff analysis, as well as the funding distribution and comparisons of the different recommendations. Following that discussion, we'll go over the council subquorum request, the BEATF alternate recommendation, and the staff response to that alternate scenario and comparisons. And then finally, we'll discuss steps as we move forward through the process. So just as a refresher, in July of 2024, council passed a resolution directing the manager to bring a comprehensive bond package to City Council no later than November 2026. In August of that year, August 2024, Council established the Bond Election Advisory Task Force, and in September of 2025, Council adopted a resolution directing the manager to develop an open process for receiving project suggestions from the public and expand priority areas for BEATF evaluation. Departmental staff began by identifying and prioritizing nearly $3.9 billion in estimated needs throughout the different departments. These projects were weighted slightly towards community facilities and public safety, but pretty well split amongst public safety, transportation, and parks as well. Our next step here was that staff took that initial needs assessment along with public input received from the city-hosted and Bond Election Advisory Task Force hosted input sessions and created the initial staff recommendation shown here based on the initial total bond capacity of $700 million. These expenditures lean towards transportation, watershed, and parks with a goal of minimizing operational impacts to the city's budget. As we move through the process, in early 2026, Financial Services updated the city's bond capacity from $700 million to $750 million. The Bond Task Force, which has been meeting since October of 2024, and over the course of those 17 months, the final BEATF recommendation was for a total of $766 million. Important differences here between the task force recommendation and staff's recommendation is the $200 million for affordable housing and the funding of several new community facilities, which represent an increase from $131 million from $58 million. Those community facility investments recommended by the BEATF do have significant operating impacts on the city's budget. And in addition, the BEATF also decreased the funding for transportation from $251 million in the initial draft recommendation to $147 million. Later on in the presentation, there's a comprehensive slide showing the options and the differences in those recommendations. So the updates from the initial staff recommendation are shown here in light blue. These changes are based on input received from the public and task force to adapt that initial recommendation based on that feedback. You'll see the updated staff recommendation increased the total to $750 million based on the increase in capacity provided by Financial Services. The primary changes here are a $28 million reduction in the watershed protection line item, $41 million increase to parks, and a $37 million increase in community facilities. And again, these changes were made based on input from the BEATF as well as the public response to the initial draft recommendation and community engagement efforts that were underway throughout the process. So one major discrepancy here between the updated staff analysis and the BEATF recommendation would be the housing piece of that. Staff did not include additional dollars for housing in this recommendation because of the $170 million balance approximately that is remaining from the 2022 housing bond. This chart shows a proposed funding distribution for the updated staff recommendation by council district. The named projects are shown in the funding amounts and percentages for a total of $324 million in named projects, and the remaining $426 million are in programmatic buckets that are implemented throughout the city. For districts that have lower percentage totals, the citywide buckets are able to make up some of that difference, and those citywide projects are implemented through various council-approved plans from individual departments. So, for example, TPW has the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan that guides its investment in transportation infrastructure. In addition, there are land acquisition items in the citywide buckets that by their nature are just not known at this time, as well as open space, parkland acquisition, and the line item for the Homeless Resource Center. So this slide provides sort of a single resource to refer to related to these three recommendations in the $750 million range. Again, as I mentioned, some of the main differences between the staff recommendation and BEATF includes the prioritization of transportation infrastructure, particularly in light of the uncertainty surrounding the future of the transportation user fee. Staff felt it critical to fund transportation infrastructure projects. There was large support from both the public and the BEATF for in the community facilities category, which was increased. However, it's important to note that any new facility or any alteration to an existing facility would have impacts on the city's operating budget, and the impact of those varies depending on the type of project. So, and then as I mentioned, the final major difference is not including affordable housing in the final staff recommendation because of that funding that's remaining in the 2022 bond and the ability for the housing staff to adjust the spend in that category based on the funding that's available. So this graph shows a summary for the 16, 18, and 2020 bond programs that are non-housing related. The red line shows expenses, dark blue is obligation, and the purple line is the spending plan. The royal blue line shows that 90% bond dollar value at $1.67 billion. Our programs tend to have a long tail on the end of them, of the spending curve, as you can see here. This is mainly due to the size of some of the projects. We tend to reach 90% spent about 3 years before the bonds are fully expended. What happens is the larger construction contracts have longer contract durations where the actual spending doesn't take place until after most of the other bond programs are completed. And this can lead to a case similar to what we're facing now, where some of the bond programs are complete, but the overall bond is not spent and some of that debt has yet to be issued. As you look at the graph here, you can see that the bond programs, when added together, are projected to be at 90% spent in 2028. And one of the key results that I do want to emphasize here, and I've said before in previous presentations, is that since the creation of CDS in 2023, project spend has more than doubled from $573 million to $1.3 billion, and the authorized but unobligated balance has been more than cut in half from $1.4 billion to $398 million. This means that projects are moving forward through the design phase and into construction, and we're awarding those contracts and getting these projects delivered that were outlined in the past bond programs. So let's talk about existing bond spend. One of the things that Council has recently adopted is the decision tree, which is a disciplined, transparent tool that allows the Council to evaluate bond necessity, prioritize projects, manage financial impacts while incorporating public input. It's designed to prevent past issues of frequent poorly coordinated bond elections, ensure that voter-approved projects are delivered efficiently and responsibly. That draft decision tree was in January, and it's been through audit and finance review, and then Council adopted that framework in February of 2026. Currently, there are 4 bond propositions from 2016 and 18 that are at 90% spent or higher, including AFD, EMS, the 2018 Housing Bond, Watershed, and Austin Public Health. Now, there are sub-programs within each proposition that have achieved a 90% spend. Those programs are sidewalks, safe routes to schools, streets and traffic signals in TPW, as well as aquatics, infrastructure, and land acquisition in parks. In the 2020 and 2022 bonds, there are no propositions or programs that are at 90% spent. However, the cumulative spend on all programs related to sidewalks, safe routes, streets, and traffic signals in the transportation bonds are over 90%. So Since mid-April, staff was meeting with individual council offices to discuss bond development process to date, as well as upcoming council actions related to calling for a bond election. At this point, a subquorum of council posted on the council message board requesting staff and the BEATF to develop an alternative scenario for parks, funding at $250 to $260 million, community facilities at $50 to $60 million, and active transportation at $75 to $80 million. The bond task force took the subquorum instruction and approved the following: transportation funding at $80 million, Parks and Rec at $225, and community facilities at $131, for a total of $436 million. You can see here there's a mix of named and programmatic projects that are included in the bond task force's $436 million recommendation. In addition, staff also prepared an alternative scenario based on the subquorum request, with transportation at $92 million, Parks and Recreation at $250, community facilities at $58, for a total of $390. These projects also are a mix of named projects and buckets as well. And the subquorum here really represents an increase to the parks funding from the $750 million bond at $181 million in the 750 scenario versus $250 in this scenario. So this slide again is an overall scenario comparison of the subquorum request. Provides a resource as you look across the board here, and you'll see that the BEATF recommendation exceeded the funding recommendation for community facilities, but is a bit lower on the recommendation for parks from the city council request. So when we put all of this information together based on the decision tree and the city's financial policies, it's staff recommendation that the bond election be held in 2028 and that interim financing options be explored to address the funding gaps that exist within the bond programs that have reached 90% spent. And those include, as I mentioned before, the TPW, sidewalks, safe routes, streets, traffic signals, watershed protection, parks for aquatics, infrastructure, and land acquisition. And I know that was fast and a lot of words, but at this point, I'll open it up for questions.
Anybody have questions? If you do, let me know. Yes, go ahead. Councilmember Ellis.
I know these gentlemen next to me were chatting, so I didn't know if they needed anything. No, I'm not distracted. I just wanted to make sure if y'all had something you needed to jump on, that you had the opportunity to do that. I really appreciate the recommendation. I know we've been having a lot of discussions over the past few years about what level of funding or if a bond's appropriate for this year. I've had a lot of folks come to me and say that they really hope that we do a bond this year. I know that we've been watching our dollars, making sure that our budgets that we adopt can best fulfill all the service needs of the community. But at the same time, we know that these voter-approved bond dollars are some of our best opportunities to deliver real, meaningful, tactile projects, hopefully across all districts. And so I need to go back and review the exact funding recommendations that the other subquorum had put together. But I would say that I would like to do a bond. I may want to adjust some of the categories a little bit. And I know that over some of the iterations that the task force has come up with, sometimes the Hampton Branch Library expansion gets added back in and then gets taken back out. And so if I'm going to support a bond moving forward, I think we need to make sure that that expansion is there. It is the only city-owned community meeting space in District 8 that's not in Zilker Park or a fire or EMS station. And so it's one that we use as our workhorse. It's next to Dick Nichols Park, and so a lot of families can ride their bike there. The kids love returning the books and picking out new ones. And we've hosted our community there for a number of years, and it is busting at the seams. If anybody was able to attend the community fair, you'll know what I mean. But particularly, I would put my finger on wanting to make sure we're doing a lot for our Parks and Recreation Department, including new land acquisition. I think that's one that I'm hearing most about is, you know, the increasing cost of land over the years is going to continue to burden the city if we want to create our long-range plan for the park system. And so I think it's important for us to be expeditious about that and keep that moving forward. And then I also want to give a plug to the active transportation projects. I know the 2020 mobility bond, the $460 million, has really put Austin, Texas on a global map of safe bike ped infrastructure so that people can get out of their cars when they want to take a trip in a different fashion, which is part of our ASMP goals. I know we just had a robust conversation about fighting climate change and making sure that we are responsible stewards of other sorts of infrastructure that the city council makes decisions on. And I think getting people out of their cars is going to do a lot to reduce our emissions and help with climate change and global warming on a very impactful scale. And so I know that our program with sidewalks, bikeways, shared use pathways, urban trails has been just churning and burning. They have been laying down miles and miles of safe and active transportation, and I really want to keep that energy going, because I think if we put a pause on it, it's going to be very hard to get the machine going again. And so I think that's something that I'm really eager to look forward to. I haven't landed on an exact dollar amount necessarily, but I definitely want to open up what the other subquorums looked at, because I think there's some really great proposals to be addressed here. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Councilmember Siegel, I believe, right? And just heads up, the mayor had to depart. I don't have the screen, so just raise your hands. I'll get you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, and thanks all for this presentation. I did want to take issue with the proposed funding distribution slide. I know we're not so much talking about the full $750 million proposal, but not only does it have District 7 as the lowest percentage of program recipients, it also lists William Cannon Bridge, which is decidedly not a District 7 asset. So I don't know if that was just an error in the examples or if that was part of the 1.5% that goes to D7, but just wanted to flag that. But for my colleagues, I mean, I'm a part of the subquorum that, requested consideration of a kind of a mid-level bond package, and I just want to really emphasize that I think a parks investment would be really appropriate this November, because the parks capital fees have been, basically exhausted because of the way our city has grown, and the outlying areas don't have the same park infrastructure because of some of the older facilities that need improvements, whether it's pools, park bathrooms, and so forth. I guess I would really like to urge my colleagues to consider at least a parks bond this November. Thank you.
Councilmember Duchin.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I've got a couple of questions here. One is, I saw that land acquisitions in two categories. It's in parks and it's also in watershed. Can you help explain the differences and what you're thinking for those different categories?
Yeah, so the parks acquisition would be related to the development of parks. The watershed acquisition would be related to watershed protection, flood risk reduction, that kind of thing, water quality type of acquisitions.
Is there any circumstance where there's dual usage, or are these totally segregated?
Yeah, no, there are opportunities for dual usage for both of those. Obviously, the watershed protection land, is generally used for recreational activities, trails, and things like that. Where a dedicated parkland is what you think of as a traditional park with slides and playscapes and that kind of equipment on it.
Okay, I'm just trying to make sure I can understand and communicating to constituents, if we're thinking about total land acquisition in a particular bond, can I safely then include both of those categories? And if both for different circumstances or different use cases can be appropriate for public use.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm curious, I know in the past we've talked about a capital delivery service dashboard, or better consolidating the information that's online. Any updates you can share with me about the status of that?
Yeah, we're working on dashboards talking about past bond spending. Our goal is by the end of the fiscal year to have that up and running. We have a draft that's in place right now that we're currently in the process of doing kind of our internal review, as well as accessibility reviews and making sure that it's user-friendly and all those other kind of things. But we are able to pull the bulk of the data from our systems, which automates a lot of the issues. As you can imagine, Capital Delivery Services manages somewhere on the order of 400 individual CIP projects. So that's a lot of data that's coming in, and you don't want that data entry to have to be really manual to update any kind of outward-facing dashboard. So we've made those connections, and we're in the process of refining the beta version of the whole thing until we are able to test it further and roll it out, with the goal of having it done by the end of this fiscal year.
Got it. Okay. Last question is just, as you're thinking about this discussion about 2026 and 2028, how much sort of peer analysis in Texas or outside of Texas have you all looked at in terms of who out there has has implemented bonds in a manner similar to Austin over the last 20 years, where it's sort of been per category or subject matter, sometimes successive bonds in successive every 2 years, versus having a more rigid 6, et cetera, year cycle for a more omnibus bond?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't done in-depth analysis in terms of that. I will say that Austin stands alone a little bit in terms of the frequency of the bonds that we've done in the past several years. I think one of the main things we looked at as a part of this particular exercise was really looking at the 2025 bond elections and which, in a decidedly poor performing year for bond elections, what individual propositions were successful. We found that the infrastructure type of projects really tended to be more successful than facilities and things like that. So we can develop some more information related to peer cities when it comes to how their bonds are spread out and how they're sequenced. But I will just tell you from anecdotal evidence that the city of Austin kind of stands alone in terms of the frequency we've done, especially in that 16, 18, 20, 22. You don't see a lot of cities that have done bond elections in that frequency in the value that we have.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Last question is, in your, find it here, in I think the recommendations, you talk about interim funding. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, is there any very rough numbers in your minds right now about the scale of interim funding or COs or whatever instrument you guys would use to bridge us if as an option for 2028?
Yeah, there's several different options that are available in terms of the quantity of funding and the method of funding that's available as well. And it depends a lot on input from the council in terms of what that appetite is. Councilmember Ellis just mentioned talking about funding safe routes to schools and sidewalks and things like that. There's varying levels that you can do that based on input that we receive on this proposal or a future direction on how to go.
There's no hard limits, though. I mean, 100 million, 200 million, 500 million, any of those numbers. If you had council direction, all of those are plausible or realistic.
I'm going to defer to Ed Van Enu on that one in terms of plausible and realistic. I think there's what's financially plausible and then what's politically feasible are can be two different things.
We've been working with Ed Van Enu, Chief Financial Officer. My team's been working with Eric and CDS on where the gaps might exist between funding we currently have and what it would take to bridge the gap to a 2028 bond, and making sure that the use of non-voter approved debt would be appropriate for those areas, and it would be.
But to that question of are there any rough numbers you all are looking at or playing with that can give us any clues about what sort of proposals you all might be putting together to present to us as options for how to bridge that gap if we compare those to some of the 2026 options you all have presented in this presentation?
Yeah, and I think that Eric might have a little bit more on that, but the conversations that we've had, I believe it's in the areas of park maintenance, trails, sidewalks, or some of the gaps, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 200 million, somewhere in that range would be the amount needed to keep those programs going until we had another comprehensive bond. And the other areas like streets and bridges currently have enough funding, affordable housing currently have enough funding in previous bond programs to keep us going until 2028. And correct me if I got those numbers a little bit off, Eric.
No, I think some of the information that we provide a council member is in terms of those areas that have actually reached the 90%. Mm-hmm. I think those are the areas that we were talking about in terms of potential future funding.
Okay, I'll be curious if you have any, if not now, going forward, if you can attach specific numbers or even rough numbers to what those categories look like, so we can understand the scope of what you're thinking about for using CO dollars as a bridge option relative to the 2026 options that are shared in this presentation. Thank you.
Councilmember Alter.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, I think, largely echo what Councilmember Ellis mentioned before. I do think an investment in our parks are desperately needed. Whether that is the Garrison Pool that I represent and that serves District 3 residents, District 2 residents. We heard from somebody today about the value of that piece of infrastructure to South Austin, and even the seniors we saw today from Gus Garcia. I think that is an area where spaces that people can be indoors as well and have, I think a common theme, whether it's the pool or the senior center, spaces when it's hot. Someone can go and relax, or they're swimming or just enjoying the indoors. And these are really wonderful spaces for varying ages of the community. Of course, also want to mention the land acquisition. We find ourselves in the time of being able to have slightly down prices, which is not the norm here in Austin. And so I want to be able to make sure we can take advantage of that. And then I do think it's really important that we deliver some of the park's infrastructure that the community has kind of been expecting and asking for. We do a good job of acquiring a parcel and making that parcel available, whether that's just kind of via trail or just, be space that can be enjoyed in the community. But a lot of the neighborhoods want to know, when's that playscape coming? When are we going to be able to have, some of the infrastructure that we have, seen beautiful pictures of? And so I think that's something that we need to do more of as we're thinking about this bond planning process. And recognizing, once again, in these spaces, I think the library that Councilmember Ellis mentioned, these are, once again, spaces that allow for communities to come together and have that space out of the elements. So I do support looking in that realm. I also want to just, as we think about the conversation we had earlier today, around our environmental impacts, I was really happy to see, as part of the process, that y'all kind of scored the CO2 impact of these various categories. And sidewalks have a negative impact because they're getting people out of their cars. Vision Zero, a negative impact. I really think one thing we haven't talked about, the electrical vehicle charging infrastructure, a huge impact for the cost. You get a real bang for the buck there. Bikeways, trails, all of these things lowering our CO2 as emissions as a community because they're getting people out of cars and just into the neighborhood. So I would certainly support those as well, those active transportation projects. Last, I just kind of want to highlight or foreshadow tomorrow in the Audit Finance Committee, we are going to be having a discussion and ultimate vote on the policies, our financial policies. And I know you mentioned that the decision tree as it relates to the existing policies might say we're not at that 90% spend yet, but we have a decision before us of whether we look all our bonds or proposition specific. And if we do move to a proposition specific regime, then, as I think you mentioned before, there would be some areas where we have already reached that point, or we would meet the threshold of that 90% if we're taking that more limited view. Is that correct?
I'd say you'd have to look even deeper than that and look into the individual programs that are within a proposition. So a great example would be like the 2016 Transportation Mobility Bond, right? That bond as a whole isn't at 90% right now, but there are sub-programs in there, sidewalks and Vision Zero and traffic signals and things like that, that are at or exceed the 90% threshold. So you almost have to go a level below just the proposition level into the program level that's described within the propositions.
Okay. And I don't have the big slide or the presentation in front of me, but I do remember when you came to Audit Finance, there were kind of two parks-related ones. There's the facilities piece, and that one is kind of stuck because of the Dougherty Arts Center. Until we figure that one out, we'll never hit 90%. But for all intents and purposes, it is there if you take that off the table. And then the other parks one, we're getting pretty close. It's going to be right at the edge of 90, but we're right there. And I think that's as we talk about parks, obviously today seems to be a dominant theme. I think just the Dougherty Arts Center is really throwing off our math, and that's we've just got to figure that out. That's going to be another conversation. Two last plugs. One thing that I don't think has been brought up enough in the conversation is related to cultural arts. And I think both from a community perspective, the enrichment of cultural arts is very vital, whether that's the Paramount, Mexicarte, the Umlauf, which I am fortunate enough to represent. But in many of the instances, you talked about some of the facilities that were recommended and the operating costs that come with those. A lot of these are partnerships. I'll take the Umlauf, for example, which I would advocate for including. They operate it. We help with some of the capital funding, but it doesn't hit the city's operating expenditures. And so it's a way for us to leverage our dollars even further, and not just from an operating perspective, but they're offering more than a 2-to-1 match in terms of we bring dollars to the table and they'll go raise outside money. Same with the Paramount. And so I think being able to leverage those partnerships so that we're not completely on the hook, make our dollars go further, is something we should continue to analyze the impact there. So I appreciate your work. I know it's been a long 17, 18 months. You as well.
Marcus has been.
You've had a child since we've started this, so you're clearly this is no small feat. But I hope we can get somewhere that really does meet the need. Because like Councilmember Ellis, I've heard from so many people, with their investments that we need to make in the community, and it's long since time. So, thank you so much.
Couple of quick comments, if there are no other council members. I just really more echo Councilmember Ellis and Councilmember Alter's comments, especially around the active transportation. And again, in light of the conversation that we just had around carbon emissions, local carbon emissions, and doing everything that we can to reduce local carbon emissions, we've been successful in our sidewalk build out, in our bicycle urban trails build out, and those are so effective in reducing, as we saw on the chart, transportation is a major source of carbon emissions, and I think that's where the gains are to be had, and we have had success from the Transportation Public Works and Capital Delivery Services in executing some of the larger projects. Wishbone Bridge, I think, is the highlight of virtually everyone's year. It's just a gorgeous project, and I went out to visit it, and just extremely well done. I think about the Shoal Creek, the underpass there, where we're cutting under 2222 to connect the trail. We've built out a lot of the easy parts, and we've got those kind of connections to make it a complete and thorough bicycle connection. Those are going to be trickier, though. Some of those kind of bypasses and some of those more difficult connections are going to cost money, but they really get people, I think, out of their cars and into active transportation, alternative forms of transportation. So I just wanted to echo the desire for those. And again, I was also part of the parks subquorum that was posted on the message board. Parks are so central to the identity of Austin. They're so valued by people here, almost uniquely among so many communities that I know. They're essentially out of capital funds. Parks is essentially out of capital funds. And I do feel an obligation to continue to kind of get them some capital dollars so they can continue to make investments. And it's a multi-generational. Kids are at parks. The elderly are at parks. Like, everybody loves parks. I know that in the past we've had a lot of success. It's been very popular. The parks bonds tend to kind of do a little better than almost every other bond, and most of the bonds pass. But I just wanted to echo those comments as well. Councilmember Alter.
Process question I think it's for the manager or for y'all. what happens next between this conversation and ultimately ordering a bond election? I assume that would come in August. I have not done this before. I know some of my colleagues here have, but what happens now?
Loaded pause there. What we would need to do is come up with whatever the final recommendation is, whether it's a parks only bond and that kind of thing. We would come forward with a request for council action. We would do a ordinance to that, which would basically outline the amounts in each bucket if we do multiple buckets or just whatever it is. And then the election, the very last day to actually call the election, I believe, is August 17th. We'd want to make sure we get it on the council agenda in advance of that in case there was anything that went sideways. But that's really the way that the process would work, would be council action related to what is going to go into the bond and then a separate council action calling for the election. With the upcoming break and things like that, we do have a placeholder that's on the May 28th agenda. That's a pretty full agenda, but that can also be moved if necessary until after the break. But then we're in budget season and things like that. So we'll work on that and when we want to bring that forward and the details there.
Well, as we're planning ahead, it would be my request. I know Councilmember Fuentes is on maternity leave, and I know Councilmember Harper Madison just, I think, had surgery as well, so she's recovering. And, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of investments directly into various council districts. I think it would be great if we could have this be a decision when they get back. So that would be July, and I know that kind of throws us into budget and the other craziness that I'm sure that is not going to be a short agenda either, but I just think this is such an impactful decision that I would hate for them to not have their constituents' voices represented.
Manager?
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember, and thank you, Eric and team. I think, I won't say we skipped a step, but I think tomorrow's conversation, I think at the Audit and Finance Committee on how we're looking through the lens of whether or not we actually have a bond program juxtaposed to the decision tree and any modifications to our financial policies, I think is a first step. And then some communication broadly from that committee, should that be the case, to the full council on making those changes. And then I think short of the prescriptive items around timing and ordinances and calling an election, I think some clear understanding on what type of bond program, whether a scaled down one or a comprehensive or a parks only, and then having the iterative conversations with individual council members and their respective teams to determine if, in fact, ultimately we've got the right types of projects within that satisfy, I think, the community's needs and district concerns. And then ultimately we'll work over the summer, should we get a signal from council that intention is to do a bond program, to have certain types of information available to be able to have those decisions be able to be made within the time limits for you to call an election, should that be the case. And so, again, I think there's a lot of work we got to do in between. And so tomorrow will be the starting point on whether or not we begin that work. But I think that'll be critical. And as Eric said, there's placeholders on May 28th, and that could just be for the direction at that point of to go forth, work with council members and community and BEATF, whomever, to really try to figure out what that package would look like, to come back almost at the same time as the proposed budget, to have those conversations kind of separate, but in concert, particularly if there are any other alternative financing needed that would then be put into the budget in addition to a actual bond election in November. So again, I think there's a lot more conversation, but tomorrow will be critical to determine which way we go.
Thank you, Manager. I guess it probably would be a good idea to set up an additional conversation on May 28th, subsequent to the. But my sense, and again, I would look to my colleagues, is that I would be very surprised if we were ready to call a bond election and do anything like that on the 28th. That July 23rd date seems, again, well ahead of the August 17th kind of latest possible, and gives everybody a pretty good runway to kind of figure out the size and scope And also, ultimately, this will go to the public for a vote, and we want to leave plenty of time for that, and have a deliberate, thoughtful process, and not anything where we're scrambling at the end. So that July 23rd date does jump out at me as a seems like it works well for everybody. So. Well, if there are no other questions, then thank you very much for the presentation, and look forward to continuing the discussion on